Welcome everyone to Internal Auditing Skills Training Without Travel, presented jointly by AuditNet and Woodington Training. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. My name is Jim Kaplan. I'm founder and owner of AuditNet, and I'll be moderating the webinar. Joining us today is Bill Woodington, principal of Woodington Training, who will cover internal auditing basics today. Let me have Bill introduce himself and give you a brief overview of his background, and then I'll cover the housekeeping items for today's webinar. Bill?
Yeah, welcome everybody. Our third webinar in the Training Without Travel series, and today another topic out of my new auditor training class. Again, I started my own business this year after 22 years working in the audit group at Wells Fargo. The last 18 as head of learning and development for the audit and security group for Wells Fargo. Teach a series of classes, live classroom training, new auditor training, auditor in charge training, CIA exam review. I'm an IIA instructor for the CIA review class. And then 3 professional development seminars, Writing to Achieve Results, which we had a webinar, a couple topics out of that a few weeks ago, Leadership 101, and I am a Ken Blanchard instructor for Situational Leadership 2. Again, really looking forward to our webinar today. Welcome to everyone, and you'll have my and Jim's contact information after the webinar today.
Thank you, Bill. And now we'll cover the housekeeping items for today's webinar. That's a little bit about me, Jim Kaplan, and a little bit about AuditNet. You can take your time and read those. If you've paid for today's webinar, you will have the handouts, and the handouts do have that information in there. You can take a look at that. Let me cover the housekeeping items now. The webinar and its material are the property of AuditNet and Woodington Training. Unauthorized usage or recording of this webinar or any of its material is strictly forbidden. We will be recording the webinar, and if you paid the registration fee, you will be provided access to that recording within 2 business days after the webinar. Downloading or otherwise duplicating the webinar recording is expressly prohibited. We kindly request that everyone fill out the brief online evaluation questions that you'll see at the conclusion of the webinar. Your feedback is very valuable. Please take a minute or 2 to complete the survey. In addition, because the webinar qualifies for CPE credits, we will be putting up polling questions in compliance with NASBA rules. Those answering the questions will receive their CPE certificate by email within 7 to 10 business days. I should point out that this applies only to those who have paid the fee. So if you haven't paid the fee, if you're attending using the no CPE option and you do want to receive CPE, you can pay for the registration fee after the fact, and we'll gladly provide you with the CPE certificate. But you must answer the CPE polling questions that we put up. And we'll leave those polling questions open for approximately 1 minute. You will have an opportunity both during and at the end of the webinar to ask questions. Just submit your questions during the presentation via the chat window at the lower right-hand box on your screen. Type your question and press return to send it. Any question we're unable to answer by the end of the webinar will be answered via email directly within 48 hours. As moderator, I will be launching the polls, showing the results, and monitoring any questions. I'd now like to turn the floor back to Bill. Just a reminder that if GoToWebinar stops working at any point in time, just close down the application and relaunch it. And if you can't do that, there was a call-in number that you should have received. You can always call in and just follow along on the phone. So let me now turn the floor over to Bill to cover internal auditing basics. Bill?
Yeah, thank you, Jim, and again, welcome to everyone. The topics today really are the basics for our profession. Now, just to be totally candid with you, I run into a lot of people who have worked in auditing for a number of years, and they're not always clear on the topics that we'll be talking about today. These are fundamental to our profession, and I know some of you may be new to internal auditing, some of you may be more experienced with internal auditing, but I really, these are the basic types of topics, the basic skill sets I think auditors should have, and the types of things that auditors should be aware of. So I hope you really enjoy the session today. And before we get started, just thinking to myself before the webinar today, because I get questions about this, and I'm sure you do as well, and I guess the question is, what does an auditor do? I mean, what? I mean, have you ever gone to your family members or a friend and they come up to you and you say, what do you do? I work in an internal auditing group. And they say, well, yeah, what do you do? What does an auditor do? And, as many years, as I said, I worked 22 years in the audit group at Wells Fargo. Even my own family members, I think, were never really clear on the value that I provided that organization. And that's really the basics of that question. What does an auditor do? How does an auditor provide value to an organization? So I'm going to say this a couple times. If somebody walked up to me and said, Bill, what does an auditor do? I would say, well, we go out on audit projects and we test controls, processes, procedures that mitigate a key risk related to a business process that delivers some product or service for the organization that is tied to a key strategy in helping that organization achieve its goals and objectives. What? All I'm saying is our auditors, internal auditors, go out on audit projects and they test controls that could be related to some process or some procedure that mitigates a key risk. Again, a key risk related to a business process that delivers some product or service for an organization that's tied to the organization's key strategy in helping the organization achieve its goals and objectives. The point I'm really trying to make is the link between what we do on our audit projects and the success of the company. And I'll be talking much more about that as we go through this in our webinar today. I kind of went backwards when I gave you that definition of what does an auditor do, starting with controls, backing up to risks, backing up to business processes that deliver a product or service, backing up to a strategy, backing up to a corporation's or an organization's goals and objectives. But really, when we think about it from an audit standpoint, we probably think of it just the reverse of that. The goals and objectives, what are the key risks that could prevent that organization from achieving its goals and objectives, and now what are the best ways to mitigate those risks. Internal auditing basics today. Where would you rather be on a Friday? Okay, let's look at our objectives today for the training. Again, really covering some key information related to internal auditing. I want to talk about the IIA, the Institute of Internal Auditors Professional Practices Framework, and obviously the standards for our profession are part of that framework. We'll talk about that today. We'll talk about COSO, Committee of Sponsoring Organizations. And what is COSO? Why would I have that in the presentation today? We'll be talking about that, really the definition of internal control and the key components of internal control as defined by COSO. And finally today, we'll talk about the basic elements of the audit process, the key components of the audit process, planning, fieldwork, reporting and wrap-up, and follow-up. I just at a high level today cover the entire audit process just so that you're aware again of these basic elements of the audit process. Again, today, internal auditing basics. Well, I thought it might be good to start out with a definition of internal auditing. Now, this is not my definition. This is from the Institute of Internal Auditors. It was revised a number of years ago to reflect a much broader definition of internal auditing. There's a couple words, I want to highlight here. Well, let's read it first. Internal auditing is an independent, objective, assurance, and consulting activity designed to add value. And this is what I started with today. How does an auditor do that? And improve an organization's operations. It helps an organization accomplish its objectives by bringing a systematic, disciplined approach to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of risk management, control, and governance processes. Well, again, there's a few words I'd like to highlight here. Independent and objective. And I'll talk more about this when we talk about the standards here in just a few minutes. But I think one of the biggest things you bring to the table, one of the biggest values that you provide an organization is your independence and objectivity. If your audit department is structured appropriately, and we'll talk about this today as well, you should not be reporting into any business that you audit. The proper way for an internal audit department to be structured is to report directly to the Chief Executive Officer and to the Audit Committee. That ensures the organizational independence of the audit department, but certainly you as an individual need to be independent and objective as well. And we'll talk more about this again when we talk about the standards, but again, just to kind of a lead-in today, I think one of the biggest things we provide, the biggest values we provide to an organization is our independence and objectivity. We don't work in that business every day. We can come in and give a totally objective assessment on the management of risk for that organization and other best practices that could help that organization be more profitable or, again, help the organization achieve its goals and objectives. Assurance and consulting in line 2 here, the 2 main services that audit provide. Assurance work and consulting work, again, we'll talk more about this in just a few minutes. Assurance work, the bread and butter of what auditors have been doing for years. What is assurance? I actually looked this up in a dictionary before our webinar today, and this is a definition, and you can take this for what it's worth. Here's the definition of assurance. Information that confirms the correct or incorrect operation of a function. Information that confirms the correct or incorrect operation of a function. And again, as I said, assurance work is probably what most of you are doing in the audit groups that you reside in. Assurance to who? What are you providing assurance around? Assurance that controls are adequate and effective in the management of risk. Assurance to management. Assurance to shareholders, to regulators, to external auditors, to employees of the organization. Again, that the company is doing a great job in the management of risk, that internal controls are both adequate and effective, and we'll review those concepts today. We did talk about them last week in our webinar. We'll review those concepts again today. And the last line there, last couple lines, improve the effectiveness of risk management, control, and governance processes. Again, a little broader definition than the previous definition of internal auditing. We should be risk experts. That was kind of one of the themes for the webinar last week around risk. We should be risk experts, and we always sell our recommendations based on risk. Those of you who attended the webinar last week, remember the example I gave? You go to a business partner, and you've identified a control weakness, and you're trying to sell your point of view to the business partner that they need to implement a control. But you never sell it to them based on a policy. You always sell it to them based on risk. Hey, Mr. Business Partner, you're not reconciling your general ledger accounts. There's the control. The business partner may come back and say, I don't care, I don't have time. What's your response? To say, well, there's a policy that requires you to do that? No. Here's what can happen if you don't reconcile. We just had a large fraud because another group wasn't reconciling. You need to reconcile. Risk, risk, risk. And we'll talk more about risk a little bit today. Again, if you're interested in purchasing the recording from last week, Jim Kaplan has that information from you, the webinar that we did last week related to risk. Audit's impact on the company. Identify risk exposures and evaluate the adequacy and effectiveness of risk management and control practices. Now, again, just a little bit of a review. What is control adequacy? What is control effectiveness? Again, controls mitigating risk need to be both adequate and effective. But what does that mean? Adequacy is really control design. On paper, does this look like a good control? If you're an auditor and you're planning an audit, in the planning phase of an audit project, you look at control adequacy. On paper, does this control look like it would have a substantial effect on mitigating risk or not? Remember the example I gave last week? I go and audit a cash vault operation in Wells Fargo, and they represent to me that our control is it takes 2 people to open this vault door. No one person can open the vault. On paper, that looks like an adequate control. It should have a substantial effect on mitigating risk, that anybody could just walk into the vault and steal money. Control adequacy, control design, on paper, does this look like it would have a substantial effect on mitigating risk? And now control effectiveness. This is what you do in field work, testing the control to see if it's actually working. So again, that example I just gave, I watched them open the vault. And initially, I thought the vault was under dual control. It looked like the control was effective. The control was working because I noticed it took 2 people to open the vault door. One person had the key, one person had the combination. But when I asked a few follow-up questions, I asked, do you have spare keys? And if so, where do you keep the spare keys? They showed me a drawer of spare keys that was unlocked. So anybody who had the combination could easily get a spare key, and one person could get into the vault. The control was adequate. On paper, it looked like a great control for mitigating risk, but it was not effective. It was not working to mitigate risk. The planning phase, we look at control adequacy, the planning phase of an audit project. The fieldwork phase, we look at control effectiveness. The bullets on this slide are what controls should be doing if they're both adequate and effective. They ensure reliability and integrity of financial and operational information. They ensure the effectiveness and efficiency of operations, the safeguarding of assets, compliance with policies, procedures, laws, regs, etc. If controls are working, that's what should be happening. Again, our role and responsibilities. How do we provide value to the organization? And remember what I said, what does an auditor do again? You go out on your audit project, you're testing controls for control effectiveness, just what we were talking about. Do those controls actually work in mitigating risks that are related to a business process that delivers some product or service that's tied to a key strategy in the organization, helping the organization achieve its goals and objectives? The relationship, the link between what you do on an audit project with internal controls and the testing of controls and the management of risk and the success of the company. Now, you look at the bullets here. Remember, 2 main services that auditors have provided for years. And the big one is assurance work. That's what the first bullet is getting at there. Conducting tests, providing conclusive reporting regarding the health of the risk management internal control structure within the company. The second bullet is more consulting services, advisory services. Perhaps you've worked on projects that they're implementing a new system, some new consolidation of some business process, a new business process, and they're actually asking audit's advice and opinions related to building internal controls up front on a new system design, for example. And that is definitely a value-added service that auditors provide, and there's been debate over the years, should auditors do both consulting work and assurance work? Well, if you look at the IIA standards, it typically says that auditors should not do assurance work if they've been involved in consulting work, and it's typically over the last year. Some organizations, it's 2 years. Again, we go back to independence and objectivity. You never, ever want to compromise your independence and objectivity. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about this in just a few minutes. Risk issues escalated and resolved. And the last bullet here, a source of talent, training ground for other areas of the company. And I just want to share this with you. I can't remember if I mentioned this in one of our previous webinars, but when I worked at Wells Fargo, we had an auditor associate program. It was a program where we hired entry-level auditors right out of college. And I recruited for that program. I would interview students at the college campuses recruiting for our entry-level auditor program. And when I sat across the table from students, many of the students probably weren't very familiar with what internal auditing is all about. And, they were interviewing with CPA firms and, other accounting firms. And I'm not sure they really were that interested in what I had to sell initially around internal auditing. But what I told them was, where could you go right out of school? And, I kind of started with this. Do you know exactly what you want to do when you graduate? And they'll say, well, I was an accounting major. I suppose I better do accounting. And I'd say, well, I was an accounting major too, but I wasn't exactly sure I wanted to go work in an accounting department. I wasn't exactly sure I wanted to be a CPA. But if you come to internal auditing, where else could you go and see the entire company? You come, in my case, working for Wells Fargo, you'll learn about trust. You'll learn about mortgage. You'll learn about banking. You'll learn about IT. And even if auditing isn't your long-term goal, it's a great place to start. You may want to go and work in trust someday. You may want to go work in mortgage someday. And you'll know those businesses well because you've audited those businesses. A source of talent for the company, but I also want to say this, it's a career as well. We need career auditors. We need experts in auditing, experts in risk. Again, going back to the topic that we talked about last week. Who's our customer? You know, this is a kind of a debatable question. Who is the main customer of the Internal Audit Group? I would say it's the Audit and Exam Committee, the A&E committee of the Board of Directors for your company. And you can see in the bullets there, I won't read those to you, but you can see the types of things the A&E committee gets involved in. The A&E committee is really our main customer. All right? Again, if you're reporting, if your audit department reports correctly, you should report directly to the Audit and Exam Committee of the organization. Your chief auditor should report directly to the A&E committee of the organization, functionally and administratively to the chief executive officer. Very, very important. All right, well, just to see if you're paying attention in this little initial phase, let's do our first polling question today, and then we'll move on. Jim, do you want to open up the first polling question?
Okay, which one of the following is the main customer of the audit department? Management, employees, the audit committee, or regulators? Okay, over half of you have voted. Leave it open for another half a minute or so. And we have over 90%. We'll go ahead and we will close the poll, share the results, and the majority said the audit committee. Very good.
And you are correct. Nice job, everyone. Well, let's talk about the standards for our profession, the professional standards for the practice of internal auditing. And before I do that, let me give you a little background on the standards. Now, today, just a high-level overview. Remember, today's presentation is about the basics of our profession. Well, let's talk a little bit about the standards for our profession, but how did the standards come into play? When did they come into play? And why do we have standards for our profession? Well, in the 1970s, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act came out. And just the first sentence there, the act arose because of illegal payments, bribes, made to officials in foreign countries, companies that were bribing foreign officials in foreign countries. And just a little more information is shown on this slide here. But really, the main reason I'm presenting this today is why, what happened as a result of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And it really was the fact that the Act required now any publicly traded company, any SEC registrant, to devise and maintain a system of internal accounting controls, very specific around financial controls, that these companies must have accounting controls that ensure, and you see the bullets there, transactions executed appropriately, recorded as necessary. I won't read all those to you, but these bullets relate to what accounting controls should be doing. But remember, and I'll come back to this a little bit in just a minute, but remember, this is all about requiring accounting controls. When I talk about COSO here in just a few minutes, COSO goes much, much further in defining internal control, much more broadly than just having accounting controls in place. Well, another reason I put it in this piece of the presentation is because the standards for our profession came out in 1978. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act came out in 1977, and the first standards for the professional practice of internal auditing came out in 1978. And I'm actually going to go to the IIA website here and show you what's out on the IIA website here for just a second. So I am now on the Institute of Internal Auditors website, and again, right now we're going to talk about the standards for our profession. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act comes out in 1977. The first standards for our profession come out in 1978, and they've been expanded upon and revised numerous times since then. And today, now you can always go and see the current standards right here on the IIA website. In fact, this is where you should always go to make sure that you're looking at the current standards for and guidance for our profession. All right. If you ever take the Certified Internal Auditor exam, and as I said at the start of our presentation today, I am an IIA instructor for the CIA review class. If you ever want me to come in-house and teach it in your organization, well, I'll have my contact information at the end of this. But whenever I teach the CIA review, I would say at least half of the exam extensively covers your knowledge on the standards for our profession. Exactly what I'm going to show you here. Now, they won't ask you, what does standard 2200 say? They'll give you a scenario, and if you don't know the standard, you probably will not select the correct answer. So here we are on the IIA website. How do you access the standards, and what are the standards all about? Again, the first tab here, I'm just going to click on Standards and Guidance. And this is what you're going to see when you go to the first tab here for Standards and Guidance. Mandatory guidance and strongly recommended guidance, and I've seen this on the exam numerous times. What is mandatory guidance? What is strongly recommended guidance? Mandatory guidance consists of the definition of internal auditing, which we just looked at a few minutes ago, the IIA's Code of Ethics, and the main thing here and what we're focusing on today, the international standards for the professional practice of internal auditing. Mandatory guidance, definition of auditing, Code of Ethics, and the standards. Strongly recommended guidance that you see at the bottom of the page there, position papers, practice advisories, and practice guides. Your internal audit policies and procedures for your organization should support the standards. And let's click on the standards here, and let me just show you a little bit, or talk a little bit about the standards themselves. So again, I just clicked on the link to the standards, and that's what you're seeing here, the international standards for the professional practice of internal auditing here. Okay? And you'll notice there's links at the top here for the introduction to the standards, attribute standards, performance standards. Now, what is this? Well, first, let's look at the introduction to the standards. You know, I'm not going to read all this, but I'll just mention a couple things here. If you look here, the bullets in the middle of the page that say the purpose of the standards is to delineate basic principles that represent the practice of internal auditing, provide a framework for performing and promoting a broad range of value-added internal auditing. 3, establishing the basis for the evaluation of internal audit performance, and 4, fostering improved organizational processes and operations. So when you click on the standards, you'll notice these 3 links at the top of the page here, and the first is a link to just the introduction. But now you've got 2 links here, one for attribute standards and one for performance standards. And always remember, there are attribute standards for our profession, and there are performance standards for our profession. What are the attribute standards? What are the performance standards? Let me just click on the link for attribute standards here first. Well, that's kind of a laundry list here. If I just page down here for a second, you'll notice starting in the 1000 series are attribute standards. Now look at the definition here. Attribute standards address the characteristics of organizations and parties performing internal audit activities. These relate to the characteristics of organizations and parties performing internal audit activities. You know, if we have time at the end of our webinar today, I'm going to jump to some CIA exam practice questions that get at some of the standards, just to pique your interest if you're ever thinking of taking the CIA class. If we don't have time, again, I would recommend you go here and read the standards from start to finish if you're going to be taking the CIA exam, or I would just say anybody in internal auditing should do this. But attribute standards address the characteristics of organizations and parties performing internal audit activities. All right? Now, let's take a look at just a few attribute standards here, ones that I would say, fairly passionate about. You'll notice the attribute standards, again, are all in the 1000 series. And let's look at what I've been talking a little bit already about, independence and objectivity. All right? And as I said, you never, ever want to compromise your independence and objectivity. And underneath this is a standard related to organizational independence. All right, so if I page down here, you'll see a standard here related to organizational independence. Now, remember what I said earlier. An audit department should report directly to the Audit and Exam Committee of the Board of Directors of the company. That's the functional reporting relationship. The Chief Auditor should report functionally to the A&E Committee. And the Chief Auditor should report administratively to the Chief Executive Officer. In some companies, they'll have a Chief Risk Officer. And that can be okay as well, as long as the Chief Risk Officer reports directly to the CEO. But I would say best report directly to the Chief Audit and Chief Executive Officer and directly to the Audit Committee. Now, just want to share this with you. A few years ago, I wrote articles for our local IIA chapter newsletter. I'm based here in Minneapolis, and the Twin Cities chapter puts out a newsletter like once a quarter. And I would write articles for the newsletter, and the articles, I would just interview chief auditors here in the Twin Cities area. You know, finding a little bit about what they're doing, sharing best practices, you know, and basically profiling their audit department for the article. Well, one of my initial questions I would ask the chief auditor when I interviewed him was, tell me how you report. Who do you report to? And I can't tell you, there were a number of times, too many times, I guess I should say, that the chief audit executive, the chief auditor, did not report the way the chief auditor should report. In other words, like what I just said, the chief auditor did not report to the A&E Committee, and the chief auditor did not report to the Chief Executive Officer. And they would tell me I report to the controller of the organization or the Chief Financial Officer of the organization. I don't know if you remember what happened at WorldCom. You know, a number of years ago now, a large fraud at WorldCom, a huge telecommunications company. The Internal Audit Department reported directly to the Chief Financial Officer. And who was committing the large fraud at WorldCom? The Chief Financial Officer. What? Absolutely. I mean, this is what the example I was saying here. You've got the Chief Financial Officer that the Audit Department, the Chief Auditor reports to, and that's the person committing the fraud. And I don't know if you ever read the case study regarding that fraud and what Cynthia Cooper did. She was the Chief Auditor at WorldCom at that time. Cynthia now a speaker. Many of you may have heard her speaking at IIA events. Cynthia Cooper's job and her team's job was extremely difficult because they reported to the Chief Financial Officer. Chief Financial Officer who's committing this fraud is saying, don't look at this. I don't want you to do this right now. You report to me, I'm going to tell you not to do this. And they did it anyway. They did their due diligence. They did what they should have done. Again, just showing you what can happen if the audit department does not report the way they should report. Independence and objectivity, and not only organizational independence, but individual independence as well. Okay, so again, organizational independence, and here's individual objectivity, I guess I should say, as well, that you never want to compromise. I mean, you know, I'll just give you an example. One time I was supervising an audit at Wells Fargo, and I went out to review the work papers. It was an off-site audit. And when I got there, I noticed all of our audit team members had all this paraphernalia from, you know, the business partner, T-shirts, mugs, you know, all these trinkets. And they were like, they're so nice. Look what they gave us. And I was like, you know, these were pretty minimal dollar amount items, but I'll just be honest with you. I told them, you really probably shouldn't accept that because there could be a perceived lack of objectivity here, a compromise in your objectivity. You know, this is a thing I talked about earlier when I was recruiting for the auditors, for the Audit Associate Program. Where can you go right out of college and see the whole company and talk to senior level people in the company and be objective in assessing their businesses? You know, one of the things we're going to talk about in a few weeks, some of you, if you sign up for our assertiveness skills training, we'll talk about interview skills. But our best auditors, you know, so I've had many new auditors come up to me and say, you know, Bill, I feel really uncomfortable talking to a business partner. I'm trying to be objective, but, you know, I don't really understand their business as well as they do. And I'll always tell them, remember your job here. It's not to sell them on how much you know. It's to find out how much they know. You ask the who, what, when, where, why, how. You get them to talk and tell you why they're doing this, when they do it, what's the reason for this control, when do they do it, you know, all of that. Our best auditors are good questioners, they're good listeners, and they're objective in assessing the management of risk for the organization. How many, I can't think of another group that's totally independent and objective. You don't work in that business. You can go to a different business next week and be objective in evaluating that business. Just remember, I know I'm kind of harping on this, never ever compromise your independence and objectivity. Again, we're in the attribute standards here, and I know maybe this isn't the most exciting thing, but just bear with me just for a couple more minutes because I want to mention just a couple other things here. If you look at standard 1210 under proficiency, and again, just kind of paging down here a little bit, look at 1210A2. Now, this is a good example. What are the A's and what are the C's? Because we're in the attribute standards. And remember, standards are split between attribute standards and performance standards. But how do you implement attribute standards and how do you implement performance standards? Well, that's where the A's and C's. A stands for assurance work. You see A1, A2, A3 there, and C stands for consulting work. Those are the implementation standards related to the attribute standards or the implementation standards related to performance standards. All right, A for assurance work, C for consulting. Remember the two main services that auditors provide, assurance work and consulting work. And now look at 1210A2. Internal auditors must have sufficient knowledge to evaluate the risk of fraud and the manner in which it is managed by the organization, but are not expected to have the expertise of a person whose primary responsibility is detecting and investigating fraud. All right, remember that in the normal course of your duties, and one of the topics I teach is fraud auditing in my new auditor training class. In the normal course of your duties, could you identify the red flags of fraud? You don't have to be an expert in this, but just what's normal. You know the business. Can you identify something that looks inappropriate? Again, these are all just part of the attribute standards. And then just kind of to wrap up the attribute standards here for just a few minutes, if you look at 1230, this is a passion of mine, obviously, training, continuing professional development. I saw the definition. Tell me what you think about this. What do you think the definition of an old person is? What is the definition of an old person? And it had nothing to do with chronological age. I saw this in the news the other day, and I thought they nailed it. Someone who has stopped learning. Someone who has stopped learning. You know this. You know this. People that are 40 years old don't want to learn anything new. And people who are 70 years old that are going back to school. Just whether you stay in auditing or not, just a word of advice, and I try to do this continually, never, ever stop learning. Never, ever grow old. At least from that definition. I really encourage you to continue to pursue professional certification. So in the world we live in today, with so many people holding up themselves as experts, and are we going to be taken seriously or not? Well, we are experts in internal auditing. We're experts in consulting on the management of risk. The Certified Internal Auditor exam, the global designation for our profession, and there's others as well, Certified Public Accountants, Certified Information Systems Auditors, you know, a lot, and even specialty designations from the IIA. But again, professional certification ties directly into continuing professional development. The last attribute standard I just wanted to mention is the QA program. Your audit department should have a quality assurance and improvement program, and they consist of typically internal assessments and external assessments. Internal assessments, you may have your own QA team, or you may do your own self-assessment to determine if you're doing quality audit work. When I worked at Wells Fargo, it's a very large audit department. We had our own quality assurance team that would review our work papers and give feedback on areas we did well and areas we could improve upon. We certainly wanted that information before the regulators came in-house. We wanted to identify our weaknesses before any external party would look at that. But 1312 talks about external assessments, and the IIA standard is that once every 5 years, your organization should have an external assessment. This could be from the IIA, it could be from a consulting firm, to assess, are you complying with the standards? Again, both the internal assessments and the external assessments related to quality assurance is your audit department complying with the standards for our profession? These are all attribute standards. And the only other thing, you know, I won't go through all the performance standards, but if you do click on the link for performance standards, you've got a laundry list again of performance standards here. And, you know, the only one I maybe would mention, that just because we just talked about it today, if you go down to 2130 control here, and if you take a look at this, look at 2130A1, remember the A stands for assurance work. The internal audit activity must evaluate the adequacy and effectiveness of controls in responding to risks within the organization's governance, operations, etc. Control adequacy, control design. On paper, is this a good control? On paper, does this look like it would have a substantial effect in mitigating risk? Control effectiveness, is the control working? In field work, we always test for control effectiveness. I really recommend you go to the IIA website, look at the standards for our profession, read the attribute standards, the performance standards. There's even a glossary here if you're not familiar with some of the terms. It can be very, very helpful for you. Well, let's go back to our PowerPoint. And Jim, why don't we put up our second polling question today? Which of the following is not mandatory guidance in the IIA Professional Practices Framework?
Okay, and the choices are the Practices Guides, Definition of Internal Auditing, the Code of Ethics, or the International Standards for the Professional Practice of Internal Auditing, commonly known as the Standards. Please select your choice. Those standards are constantly being updated by the profession. We've got more of half of you have voted. Leave it open for another 10 or 15 seconds, so please record your vote. And we will go ahead and we will close the poll. Reminder that if you do want CPE, you must record your choice. We'll go ahead and we will close the poll now. Share the results, and the majority said the practice guides.
And that is correct. The other three are mandatory.
Very good.
Thank you, Jim.
We'll go ahead and hide that, and back to the presentation.
Well, now let's talk about another fundamental to our profession, and we'll talk about the definition of internal control as defined by the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations, COSO, Committee of Sponsoring Organizations, COSO for short. But before I talk about COSO, I just thought I'd put this slide up in front of you. You'll know right away if you're working for a company that has it right. Maybe that's a simplistic way to put it. But when I worked in external auditing, my first 3 years out of college, I worked for Touche Ross, now they're Deloitte and Touche, and I could tell just by going from company to company whether companies really were committed to the management of risk. In other words, did control come first and then look at profitability and then go for growth? The good companies get this. And don't get me wrong, even in the good companies, not everybody gets it because there's different businesses that are run by different managers, as you know, throughout the company. But at the top of the house, let me put it that way, the tone at the top is the management of risk is essential to the success of our company. Now, how do you manage risk? What are the components of internal control, and who's responsible for the management of risk? I talked about this last week, but I can't emphasize this enough. Is audit responsible? I think a lot of people think we are. You know, I gave an example in our webinar last week where we had a large fraud at Wells Fargo a number of years ago, and when we gave them the report, the audit report, identifying the control weaknesses and the areas to correct those, they came back with the management response was, not my job. We're not responsible for this. Audit should have told us about this. You're going to need to articulate this in many, many different ways, that management, the business partners, your clients, if you will, the people you're auditing are responsible for the management of risk. Always, always. We're here to help. Don't get me wrong. We're consultants in the management of risk. Are controls adequate? Are they effective? Are these the right controls? But who's there day to day? Who's there making sure that they're working, that they're the right controls day to day? Management. Well, just to emphasize this, our third polling question, I know this is kind of quick right after the other one, but Jim, do you want to pull up this polling question today?
Who's responsible for the management of risk? Financial accounting, audit, legal, or management? Shame on you if you get this wrong. I think in my 26 years of auditing, we had to probably say this on a daily basis.
I agree.
Remind people that managers were responsible for risk and controls within their organization. Our job was to evaluate whether those controls were working and to look at the management of risk. Okay, we've got about 90% that have voted. We'll leave it open for another 10 seconds or so. Reminder that if you're attending and want CPE and you've paid the registration fee, you must answer the polling question. And we'll go ahead and we will close the poll. Share the results. 97%, almost everyone said management. Very good.
Excellent job, everyone. Well, let's talk about the management of risk, and let's talk about what are the key components that should be in play if a company is managing risk appropriately. I want to talk about COSO here. What is COSO? We'll talk about that here in just a minute, but just a little history lesson again. Remember, we just talked about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that came out in the 1970s that required accounting controls. Well, in the late 1980s, the Treadway Commission was formed basically because of fraudulent financial reporting practices going on, similar to probably what you've heard about with Sarbanes-Oxley about, 20 years after the Treadway Commission. Nothing seems to ever change if you give enough time here. But really the reason I'm referencing the Treadway Commission is a committee of sponsoring organizations was formed to support implementation of the Treadway Commission's recommendations. And if you look at that second bullet on this page that says the tone set by senior management, the environment, the culture, is the single most important factor contributing to the integrity of the financial reporting process. Remember, this related to fraudulent financial reporting. Well, this company, this committee of sponsoring organizations, now what does that mean? Well, it was a group of professional organizations. The Institute of Internal Auditors was a part of that. The American Accounting Association, the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, the Financial Executives Institute, the Institute of Management Accountants. A number of professional organizations got together to redefine internal control. That's probably the simplest way I can put that. What is internal control? Is it really just accounting controls? I know the Treadway Commission was focused more on the financial reporting process here, but isn't it time we as experts in the field of risk get together and redefine internal control? And I guess that's my question to you. What is internal control? And when I teach this in the live classroom, we kind of go around the room and just get a few volunteers. What do you think internal control is? I mean, if somebody walked up to you, hey, Bill, I hear you work in the audit department. Yeah, well, what do you do? Well, I test control adequacy and control effectiveness. And they say, well, what is internal control? What would you say? What is internal control? Well, here is the definition from the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations, COSO. A process affected by an entity's board, management, and other personnel designed to provide reasonable assurance, not absolute assurance, regarding the achievement of objectives in the following categories: effectiveness and efficiency of operations, reliability of financial reporting, compliance with applicable laws and regulations. If internal controls are working again, operations should be effective and efficient, financial reporting is reliable, and the company's complying with laws and regulations. A process. Okay? It's not a one-time event. It's not one procedure. It's a process affected by the board, tone at the top here. We're going to talk about this in a minute. Other personnel, providing assurance that the company will be successful. That's why I said you'll know right away if a company gets it. What do you mean? That they get the importance of risk management. They understand the importance of risk management in the success of their company. Makes our job so much easier when we make recommendations following an audit project. When we find control weaknesses, management understands we can't have these control weaknesses, or I'm not going to be successful. I won't achieve my goals and objectives. You know, I wasn't going to say this, but I'm just going to mention this. Years ago, and I won't mention names, I worked for an organization in an audit department. Chief auditor called me into his office and he said, Bill, what's COSO? My jaw just dropped. I don't know if you saw it, but this is fundamental to our profession. And our chief auditor, who did not have an audit background, this is years ago now, didn't understand what COSO was. Well, what is it? You will understand it, hopefully, after today. Let's talk about what is COSO. Much more broad definition of internal control now, not just accounting controls. And I don't know if you can see this cube, but if you actually looked at the COSO report, it consists of 5 components of internal control. 5 components of internal control that should be in place if the company is managing risk appropriately. And look at the bottom first. Let's go from the bottom up. A strong control environment, strong risk assessment, strong control activities, strong information and communication, strong monitoring. There are 5 components that should be in place in the management of risk, 5 components of internal control. Now, what are these components? What is control environment? What is risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, monitoring? What are, I should say, these 5 components of internal control? Well, before we look at each one briefly, here's the overall definition right out of the COSO report. The control environment provides an atmosphere in which people conduct their activities and carry out their control responsibilities. It serves as the foundation for the other components. Within this environment, management assesses risk to the achievement of specified objectives. Control activities are implemented to help ensure that management directives to address the risks are carried out. Meanwhile, relevant information is captured and communicated throughout the organization. The entire process is monitored and modified as conditions warrant. You know, one thing I'll mention at the end of our presentation today, that many organizations determine their audit rating related to the COSO components. Have we had any control weaknesses in the area of control environment? Did we identify any control weaknesses in the area of risk assessment or control activities or information and communication or monitoring? And the audit report rating is based on their assessment, on the audit group's assessment of the COSO components. Well, let's look at each one of these individually now just for a few minutes, just to get you thinking about this. If you haven't heard about COSO before, remember 5 components. The first one, 5 components of internal control for the management of risk. The first one is control environment. I don't know if I would pick one component more important than another, but if you backed me into a corner and said, Bill, you have to pick one, this would be the one I would pick. It's all about the culture of an organization. All about the culture of an organization. Those of you sat in the webinar last week, remember the story I told about my first day at work at another large banking organization? And in that my first day of work, they put me on a special project where they merged 2 proof operations, but they didn't have anybody reconciling accounts. There was no implementation plan. There was no contingency plan. And the day after they merged the 2 proof departments, the bank's out of balance by $1 billion. They have a plug account on their balance sheet of $1 billion to get the balance sheet to balance. Nobody cared about risk. Nobody cared about the management of risk. There was no tone at the top of an organization. This is one of the key components of the control environment that your chief executive officer, your board of directors, the managers of your businesses, remember they're the ones responsible for the management of risk, they get it. They get it. They understand the importance of risk management. And it's in their whole culture. The policies they have in place related to internal control and the management of risk help them to be successful. They understand that. Code of ethics, big part of control environment. Most companies do have a code of ethics. You know, at Wells Fargo, if a teller stole money out of a teller drawer, they're terminated. There's no second chance. It's a code violation. Goodbye. It's a culture that we value the management of risk here. We don't tolerate certain behaviors, insider trading or other types of things that are specified in the code of ethics. You can't work here anymore. It's not our culture. This is our environment here. Code of ethics. You know what? And this just popped in my head. I have 4 children. They're older now. And I often think of, remember I said tone at the top for control environment? I often think it's like setting an example like a parent sets for their children. A number of years ago, when one of my children was very little, I went to their parent-teacher conference. And at that time, the Minnesota Twins, I'm a baseball fan, Minnesota Twins were in the World Series, and all I did was watch baseball or mow my grass if the grass needed mowing, but I didn't do anything. I wasn't spending much time with the kids. So I go to my parent-teacher conference, and I met with Joey's teacher, and she said, Mr. Woodington, before our meeting today, I asked all the children, what do they want to be when they grow up? And she said, you know, before I tell you what Joey said, here's what the other kids said. And they, you know, what's typical, a fireman, a ballerina. You know what my kid said? He wanted to be a dad who watches TV and mows the lawn. High aspirations here for the little boy. I don't think I was setting a very good example, and he certainly was getting the message. And the only reason I tell that story is it's the same thing in companies today when they don't get it, when they don't understand the importance of the management of risk, when senior management doesn't stress the importance of the management of risk, where the business managers don't express the importance of management of risk. Do you think the team members are going to get it? If management doesn't think it's important, why would they? Control environment, the first component of internal control. Risk assessment. Do they have a process for, does the business now that you're auditing have an ongoing process for identifying and assessing risks in their business? Remember, this is management's responsibility. We can make recommendations here. What are the best ways to assess risk? What are the best controls to have in place? Some companies have a tool. If you're complying with Sarbanes-Oxley, you typically have to have a tool that identifies risks and assesses risks, identifies controls, and assesses controls in your various business functions. But again, risk assessment now, the identification and the assessment analysis of relevant risks that could prevent the company, the business, from achieving its goals and objectives. Forms the basis for how should we manage these risks, and ultimately leads to the third component of internal control, which are the control activities themselves. Remember what I said at the start today and in the webinar last week. Your job as auditors is to assess what they're doing in the management of risk. Are controls adequate and effective? On paper, good controls, are they working? When I plan an audit, control adequacy. These are the controls they're telling me they have. Are these good controls? Does it look like they would have a substantial effect on mitigating risk? And when I go to field work and test those controls for control effectiveness, if they're actually working, to see if they're working, now I've got a better picture here of the management of risk, and my recommendations will reflect that. Third component of internal control from the COSO report, control activities, and the fourth. Oh, and again, I don't want to jump past this slide too much, but we talked about this a little bit last week in our webinar, but I know we have new people today, but controls can be identified into different types, controls that prevent something from happening, and controls that detect something that happens after it occurs. Remember last week when we talked about risk, we always said to have risk you must have impact, loss, and the chance the loss could happen. Probability, the chance of loss, impact, the loss itself. Preventive controls typically reduce probability. Detective controls typically reduce impact. Two people opening a vault door prevents one person from stealing money out of the vault. Reconciling a general ledger will detect a fraud, for example, after the fraud actually occurs. It didn't prevent the fraud, but if we catch it early enough, if we reconcile this general ledger account, we can reduce our losses with regard to this activity. Preventive controls, detective controls, that's usually the main ways to sort controls. Directive controls like training, but I think you could argue training could be a preventive control. Many audit organizations only sort controls into either preventive or detective. Directive controls, training would be an example, cause or encourage a desirable event to occur. So again, the third component of internal control, control activities, our fourth component, information and communication. Does management, remember management's responsible for the management of risk, does management have good information related to whether controls are working or not? Does management communicate control responsibilities to their team members? And do people understand their control responsibilities? I gave an example last week where we had an audit I was on one time where they had our highest audit rating every year. And now this year they were going to receive our lowest audit rating. Why? Because they had turnover of key people. The communication ball got dropped. Nobody understood their control responsibilities. The fourth component of internal control, information and communication. And the last one, last but not least, monitoring. Does management monitor their controls on an ongoing basis to ensure they're both adequate and effective? All right, management's responsible for this. We have a hand in this when we do our audit work as well, when we come in and do our testing. But again, on a day-to-day basis, these five components of internal control are management's responsibility. Control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, and monitoring. What's COSO? It's fundamental to our profession. The five components of internal control, and as I said at the start, many audit organizations determine their audit rating for a business by evaluating each of these five components. Did we have any control weaknesses identified related to any one of these five? Okay, Jim, our last polling question today. Which of the following is not a COSO component of internal control?
And the choices are control environment, risk assessment, field work, or monitoring. Please take a minute or so to record your response to this polling question. We've got about 4/5 of you that have answered the polling question. We'll leave the polling question open for about another 30 seconds or so. Reminder that if you have any questions for Bill or myself, please submit them via the chat box. We'll do our best to answer those questions. Also, again, reminder that if you're attending with the no CPE option and would like to receive CPE for this event, you can always go to the AuditNet website and pay the fee, and we'll be glad to get the CPE certificate out to you, as well as the link to the recording and the handouts. Okay, we will go ahead and we will close the poll, share the results. And the majority said field work.
Excellent, everyone. Yeah, field work is not a COSO component. That is a phase of our audit process, which we'll talk about now. So last topic today I wanted to just spend a little bit of time in is briefly show you an overview of the audit process. Since this is internal auditing basics today, I felt you should have some basic understanding of each phase of the audit process. And this slide may be a little hard to read today, but I guess the main thing I wanted you to get from this slide is the audit process is cyclical. And by that I mean it starts with the annual audit plan and ends with the audit project itself, basically with the follow-up for any findings that we identified during the course of the audit project. If you look at this slide like a clock, and at the very top where it says understand the enterprise, and you go to the right now clockwise down to execute the audit plan, that's really the establishment of the annual audit plan. And I'll talk about the annual planning process in just a minute here. And then analyzing business processes, doing a formal risk assessment, that's the planning phase of the audit engagement itself. All right? The planning phase of the audit engagement, remember where we're assessing control adequacy, which I talked about earlier, is in the risk assessment there that's performed during planning. Moving around the clock to executing the audit program, that's field work, where we're doing our testing to determine control effectiveness. Again, our control's actually working. Reporting, that's the final audit report, reporting to management. Validation, or many companies call that follow-up, following up on any issues that we identified during the course of the audit to make sure that management has addressed the root cause of those issues. With corrective action plans, we would not see this in the future as a control weakness. So the only thing I really want you to get out of this slide is the audit process is cyclical, starting with the annual audit plan that determines what audits, what businesses we will audit in a given calendar year, and then the audit engagement itself, planning, field work, reporting, follow-up, and then the annual planning process starting again. Well, this annual audit planning process, what is that? I think almost every audit organization goes through some type of annual audit plan development. Typically, your senior level audit people in your audit organizations work on this. Your chief auditor will present it to the audit and exam committee. Remember, our customer now, the audit and exam committee. And basically sell the audit plan based on risk. These are the businesses we will be auditing in 2012. And these are the businesses we will be auditing in 2013. Well, why? Because these are the areas of highest risk. Different ways to look at risk, inherent risk of these businesses, and overall quality of risk management. Have we had problems in these businesses in the past? Are typically the two factors that come together to determine how frequently we audit any business of a company. Again, what is the inherent risk in this business? Is it high? Is it moderate? Is it low? And what have we seen in the past with regard to overall quality of risk management? That's where COSO comes into play. And those two factors coming together really helping us determine how frequently we audit a business. Risk can be classified differently. You see on the slide financial, technology, operational risk. But ultimately, what is the inherent risk in this business? And overall quality of risk management that we've seen in the past. Many audit departments are on a 3- or 4-year cycle. The highest risk businesses are audited every calendar year. The lowest risk businesses maybe once every 3 or 4 years. Obviously, we want to put our audit resources to where we have the most risk. So the annual audit plan, but now what happens once the audit project starts itself? And that's what I wanted to cover just briefly today at a high level, the overall steps in the audit process. Some things happen before planning, and some things happen after validation, or again, you could call that follow-up. But the main phases of the audit process are planning, fieldwork, reporting and wrap-up, and validation. And we'll look at each of those phases at a high level here as we go through the presentation. Well, first of all, what happens before the planning phase of the audit project starts? AIC stands for Auditor in Charge, and so whoever will be leading the audit project, whoever will be the auditor in charge, will be assigned to the audit project. The AIC will typically review business information. They'll send out a request to the business partner asking for some upfront information, organization charts, policies and procedures, different types of information that would help the AIC when the AIC starts to plan the audit project. Maybe a formal notification to the business partner of the dates of the upcoming audit project. Again, this is all pre-audit planning. But now what happens when we plan the audit? Again, typically the auditor in charge, the AIC, playing a major role here. Now, even though I say that, let me just also mention this. If you're not the auditor in charge on an audit project, it's not to say that you can't help with some of these activities. I think there's a misconception that the AIC has to do everything. All of us in the audit group can play a hand in helping with some of these elements of the planning process, and that's what I wanted to speak to next. What is business analysis? I think I mentioned this briefly last week, but I want to mention it again. What's the very first thing you should think about when you're assigned an audit project? Risk? No. What's the business? What's the business? Do you understand the goals and objectives of the business, their key strategies, their products and services, how they deliver their products and services, their technology, the regulations that impact the business? What's the business? And then risk assessment. Okay? Business analysis, getting your arms around up front what the business does, their goals and objectives, strategies, technology, regulations. Business analysis typically helping us form the initial scope of the audit project. Now a formal risk assessment. I'm going to jump out of the PowerPoint real quick, and this is what I showed last week in our presentation, an Excel spreadsheet. Many audit organizations use a version of this in identifying and assessing risks of the upcoming of the business that they will be auditing here in the planning phase of the audit project. A description of the risks in column D here. What are the risks in this business? How significant are these risks? Is this very high risk? Is this high risk, moderate, or low? And remember, to have risk, we're assessing risk based on impact and probability. That's what's determining whether this is very high risk or high risk. What controls has management put in place to mitigate those risks? I'm only listing the controls they do have, not the controls they should have. If they don't have a control they should have, I've got a finding right now in the planning phase of the audit project. And ultimately, determining, will we test this control in field work? Will the control be tested here in column K? What are the risks in the business? How significant are the risks? What controls has management put in place to mitigate the risks? We can even flag the control. Is it manual or automated? This might help us in our sampling approach. Is it a preventive or detective control? Ultimately, is this control adequate or not? Remember, we're always assessing control adequacy in the planning phase of an audit project. Go back to the PowerPoint. Business analysis, risk assessment, two of the main deliverables out of the planning phase. The audit program is developed after the formal risk assessment, which will guide us into how we'll actually test the controls and field work for effectiveness. A formal engagement letter delivered to the business partner, a great kickoff tool for the kickoff meeting to identify show the business partner, here are the results of our planning phase. Here are the key components of the business we've identified. Here are the key risks we've identified. Here are the key controls we've identified for mitigating these risks. And here's how we're going to go about doing our work. The planning phase, you know, when I teach my auditor in charge class, we spend a whole day on a 2-day seminar. We spend a whole day on the planning phase of the audit process. Why? Get it right here, you got a lot better chance of getting it right in field work, reporting, wrap-up, and follow-up. If an audit is well planned, we know we're going to be doing the right things in the subsequent phases of the audit project. And what is the next phase? Field work. Again, where most of you come into play here, the bread and butter of what we do, the testing for control effectiveness. You know, there's some things here I put on the slide. Some companies, some audit groups have a certain limit for the number of days of field work. Some companies have 75 days that field work must be completed. Many of our audit projects, as you know, are much shorter than that. Field work, where we do our data analysis, our sampling, our work papers are completed, and any issues and recommendations or any findings and recommendations are communicated to the business partner in writing, and the business partner must respond back to us in writing with their management response, with their corrective action plan. Remember this, whenever you write a finding and recommendation, your recommendation should address the root cause of the issue. But you always sell your recommendation based on risk. That was the example I gave earlier. Hey, Mr. Business Partner, you're not reconciling. I don't care. Here's what can happen if you don't reconcile. Here's what can happen if you don't have the control in place. When you get a response back from the business partner after you've delivered the finding and recommendation in writing, their management response should always address the root cause of the issue. If it doesn't, we're going to have the same problem down the road. The next phase, the reporting phase, and a few things on this slide may not make sense. Audit ratings matrix, that's a tool we actually used at Wells Fargo to help us determine the rating. And just to, I'll show you this here in just a minute. We evaluated the business on the COSO components, as I mentioned earlier. Control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication monitoring to help determine the audit rating. Typically, we never communicate an audit rating until we have an approved draft of the report, until the audit manager or the audit director has approved the draft of the report. If the business partner comes to you and says, hey, Bill, what do you think the audit rating is going to be? And I'm in field work, I'm going to say, I don't know. I won't know that till I have a draft of the report. We go through a formal process to help determine the rating. The report shouldn't take long to get out after field work. 30 days is typical. And usually people that work on an audit project should receive an interim performance appraisal. 40 hours, 80 hours, depending on what your standard is for your audit department. If they worked a significant amount of time on the audit project, they should receive an interim performance appraisal. And we do have an upcoming webinar on interim performance appraisals. Reports can take many different formats. I won't go through all of this. This is an example of different sections of an audit report. And this slide talks about the COSO components again, where we determine the audit rating. Now, many audit organizations have a 5-tier audit rating, 5 being the best rating, 1 being the worst rating. And we rate the business on each component of internal control, each COSO component that we talked about today. Control environment, are they a 5, a 4, a 3, 2, or a 1? Well, we didn't have any issues really related to culture here. We had many issues related to risk assessment. All right, in some audit organizations, a number of them use the COSO framework to determine the audit rating. Audit ratings, again, 5-tier scale. Some companies use a 3-tier scale. These are just possible definitions for the different audit ratings that are given in the audit report. The last phase of the audit process is follow-up or validation. They mean the same thing. So you gave a finding and recommendation to the business partner in writing during field work, and they responded back to you with their corrective action plan in writing. Now they've told you they're completed with their corrective action plan. You go back and follow up. you determine that their corrective action has indeed addressed the root cause of the issue. You go back and do more testing. Maybe you do more testing immediately if it's a high-risk issue, or maybe you wait to the next audit project before you do more testing. But there should be some formal follow-up process to determine that the issue has been fixed, that the root cause of the issue has been addressed, that management's corrective action has addressed the root cause of the issue. Now, I'll just tell you, usually management will have to tell you when they'll have their corrective action completed. And if they don't have it completed when they represent to you the date that they should have it completed, we had a policy at Wells Fargo where we reported when they went 30 days past due, the date that they said they would have the corrective action completed, we would report it to the Audit and Exam Committee. Remember, they're our customer. We're telling them, you know, there's a high-risk issue out here. The corrective action should have been completed on August 1st. We're sitting here in mid-September, and it's still not fixed, and you should know about this. Issue escalation. That's part of the follow-up process. The last thing I wanted to mention about the audit process is what I call business monitoring, not one of the four main phases. Remember the four main phases of the audit process: planning, field work, reporting and wrap-up, and follow-up. Business monitoring is really what we do between audits. I like to think of it as a calling program, staying in touch with our business partners. Have they had any changes to their business? New products and services, new risks. Maybe they should have new controls in place. Maybe we need to escalate the next audit. We're not going to audit them in 3 years from now. We're going to audit them next year. A formal process to monitor the businesses that we audit. So we're not just talking to them during the course of the audit project. We're talking to them on an ongoing basis with regard to risk management. Well, with that, I'm going to open it up to questions. We've got a few minutes left today. Any questions about any of the topics today? And I do want to put up our contact information. Again, I teach seminars. I'd be happy to come to your company. You've got my email address. If you have any interest in any of the training that I provide, just send me an email at bill@woodingtontraining.com. All of my course outlines are on my website that you see there. I'd be happy to get back to you, and we can talk much further about that. And Jim's contact information related to AuditNet is here as well. But with that, I'll open it up for questions.
Yeah, Bill, there should have been a chat message that you received from Jenny in regards to the appropriateness of internal audit undertaking control activities.
Okay. And I'm having trouble seeing that question right now. Oh, I think I see it. Hang on. From Jenny, I do see it. Is it appropriate for internal audit to undertake control activities, such as approving system access requests, approving requests to issue cash flows, reviewing potential supplier finance? Well, let me just say this right at the top. No. Auditors should not be undertaking control activities. Again, I go back to that's management's responsibility. If you ever sit for the CIA exam, please do not get this wrong. They test this numerous different ways. They'll give you a scenario. And the incorrect answer is always that auditors are doing, are responsible for the internal controls. All right? Management's responsible for the internal controls, not audit. Always, always.
And the key test there would be that, if you were to go back and evaluate and have to audit that particular function, it wouldn't be appropriate for you to be approving requests or anything along those lines, because basically you'd be auditing that. If you approve something that was inappropriate, you really can't criticize yourself.
Absolutely.
Okay, if anybody else has any questions, please submit them. We have a few minutes left, and Bill will remain with us. And I guess Jenny did post a follow-up to that. She means performing the control, not reviewing the effectiveness of the control performed by someone else.
Yeah, and again, that's the answer we just gave. We should not be performing the control.
Exactly.
Other comments or questions today?
Yeah, please don't feel shy, and there is no such thing as a quote stupid unquote question. All questions will be addressed, and we'll try our best to answer them.
Now,
If
as you're thinking about questions today, I do want to mention we have a webinar 2 weeks from today that will go into much more detail around field work. So today I just briefly mentioned that as one of the components of the audit process, but much more detail in our webinar 2 weeks from today on field work. And we have upcoming webinars related to internal performance appraisals, assertiveness, and other basic audit topics as well that you'll find on the AuditNet website.
Very good. Well, it doesn't look like anybody else has any questions, Bill, so I want to thank you today for the presentation. I want to thank all of those of you that joined us today, and for paying attention and answering the polling questions. Reminder again that if you signed up for the no CPE option and would like to receive CPE for today's event, all you have to do is pay the registration fee, and we will go ahead and get that out to you. The purpose of our Training Without Travel webinars is to provide you with high-quality, low-cost online alternative training solutions covering timely topics with value-added resources and tools that you can use in your job. We bring the world's best subject matter experts directly to your desktop with timely information. And as Bill mentioned, the next webinar in this series is field work, and that will be 2 weeks from today. So we look forward to you joining us. And thank you, Bill, and I'd like to wish everybody a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Take care.